This comment about the hard problem of consciousness came in, and I wanted to answer it. It's a good question. Broadly speaking, the hard problem, as it's framed in the West, was invented by David Chalmers, and Chalmers described it as the problem that the hard mechanistic stuff happening in the brain, the firings of neurons and so forth, doesn't actually translate into, in any mechanical way, the soft internal experiences we have in the theater of our own mind. It feels like you're looking at a screen in your mind. But neuroscientists only see neurochemical signals and the firing of neurons. There's no eyeball inside your brain, for example, observing a physical object. So there's this question of how is it possible that electrons, protons, and neutrons that don't have a private theater of subjective experience could both generate and then have a subjective experience, for example, of the visualized apple. The issue of qualia is related. Through the medium of the five senses, you experience physical objects that seem to have various qualities. However, we know that a dog, for example, doesn't see the same colors as a human being, at least in large part. And therefore, we know that those colors are not coming from these objects themselves. Wavelengths of light stimulate the eye organs of various beings, and those beings then have the experience, the subjective experience, of objects being various colors. But objects themselves are not actually various colors. To illustrate this more clearly, think about the example of sharks. Sharks have this additional sense called electroperception. Electroperception is the ability to detect electromagnetic fields. For a shark, it may be the case that they see those electrical fields in the same way that you and I see the ordinary spectrum of light, as red and green and blue and so forth. It may be the case that sharks hear electric fields. It may very well be that sharks have an additional sensory power that doesn't map to any of our five senses. In other words, it doesn't appear to them as a visual thing, a sound, a smell, a taste, or a tactile sensation. Likewise, pigeons have magnetoreception or magnetoperception. What this means is that they can detect magnetism. This is how they travel very long distances around the Earth, migrating without getting lost. Likewise, for them, it may be that those patterns of magnetism appear as something coming from one of their five senses. Maybe their mind interprets it that way, but it could also be that they have an additional sensory power that is unlike the five that we have. So for us, there's no direct experience of what magnetism is, in the same way that, for example, when you hear my voice, there's vibrations coming through the speakers of your device that travels through the air, it hits your eardrum, that gets transformed into a mental image of sound. Your mind interprets that sound based on past experiences and your expectations, etc., and then produces basically like a mental image of a kind, a qualia of there's someone talking on this screen that I'm looking at. So your mind organizes the stimulation into a soft experience that is something private and personal, actually. Likewise, if a pigeon has a sixth sense for magnetism, or a shark has a sixth sense for electrical fields, then as human beings, we have absolutely no idea what those experiences are like, because sensory experiences are something that only occur when physical things interact with the sensory organs of conscious beings, and we don't have that particular type of sensory organ. In the same way, color, shape, sound, smell, taste, etc., are only things that arise because we're conscious beings interacting with physical reality. Consciousness is a bit different than this in that it can generate its own experiences that don't necessarily depend upon the five external senses. Physical science deals in mechanics, structures, processes, etc. of physical things. However, there's a gap in that no amount of functional information about the physical parts making up the brain can explain why it is that you have a private theater of experiences inside your mind in which the image, the visualized image of an apple, for example, can appear. Likewise, it can't explain why it is that when you look out at the vista for me here, I'm looking out my window, you see colors and you see shapes. Those things aren't actually part of the nature of the objects that you're looking at in the way that you're seeing them. What you're seeing is what your mind has constructed based upon the way that your senses have been stimulated. But the subjective experiences that you have because of those senses being stimulated is actually not entirely mappable to physical reality itself. This is the problem. The visualized apple doesn't have mass. It doesn't have velocity. It doesn't require anything to light it up from the outside. It doesn't need air to transmit sounds to your mind. It doesn't need to emit particles that you can smell in order for you to smell it. You don't even have to have a mouth to be able to taste it with your mind. So this apple is extremely unusual in physical terms. When you're talking about a visualized apple, the only sense organ, as they would say in Buddhism, that is cognizing that apple is consciousness itself. Your eyes can't see it, your ears can't hear it, your nose can't smell it, your tongue can't taste it, you can't actually reach out and touch it with your body. The only sensory organ you have that can detect it is consciousness itself. So this creates a natural bridge between talking about the visualized apple that has extremely unusual properties that can't be detected by any of the 5 instruments you have that are designed by nature to detect physical objects and can only be detected by one of the instruments you have at your disposal, consciousness. And so therefore, since the apple is so strange, as you said, it's not real in the sense that it's a physical object in the quote unquote real world, but it is very much there and experienced, and you can make it as complex and intricate as you please. We're talking about the hard problem of consciousness and whether or not consciousness is physical. Since visualized images can only be detected by consciousness, it points out the strangeness of consciousness more than focusing on qualia, which are largely external to you. So what's the key takeaway? The key takeaway is this. If you look at this apple that can only be cognized by your consciousness and can't be cognized by any of your other 5 external senses, that apple has extremely strange properties to the point where, as you said, you can't even say it's a real thing in the sense that it's made of physical stuff. How in the world is it possible that a huge portion of your day is made up of stuff that doesn't exist in the physical world? And why haven't you noticed? And why isn't that important to you? And how much stranger must this thing be that can detect all of that? How much stranger must this thing be that can generate this thing that doesn't exist in the physical world and then know it and experience it and interact with it in a virtual space that no one else in the entire universe, unless you believe in clairvoyance, has access to? I mean, that's just astonishingly strange. And once again, this is one of many reasons that the hard problem of consciousness is not considered to be solved by modern cognitive science. And I like to use this example, one, because it's not solved by modern cognitive science, and I don't think it will be solved because the problem is not solvable by nature, in my humble view. But also because, as a meditator, as someone who's training in meditation and training towards enlightenment, one of the realizations you need to have is that consciousness is not just like every other physical thing you've ever experienced. It's something unique and quite different and quite special. And once you've realized this, in particular directly in meditation, then you can start making progress towards investigating the actual nature of consciousness through diving in and looking even more closely at your mind. This is why I focus on this particular example, and this is why I think this particular example is so important.